society much in flux, in the midst of evaluating how its culture might be revamped in the face of pressures that I will talk about tonight at some length. We look tonight at a confusing scene, at self-styled modernist Jews who seek to identify ways to conserve Jewish culture, at self-styled integrationists who espouse a Jewish nationalism, at progressive educators who seek to sustain the most denigrated of traditional schools, the Heder. We look at conversations I've located, mostly in previously unexamined archives in Russia, that unsettle something of what we thought we knew about Russian Jewry. We look at conversations that, given what we thought we knew, ought not to have happened. It is my intent to display them for you and to examine what they reveal in East European Jewry's messy, contradictory, intriguing adaptation to modernity. We look tonight only at self-consciously modern forces in East European Jewry. Before the Russian Revolution, there were, of course, others. These were in the majority. Still, the texture of traditional Jewish culture, too, came to be muddied in these years, reshaped at its more popular levels, and perhaps also for its elite, by many of the forces we discussed tonight. They too then, however indirectly, are part of our story. There are any number of quotations with which we could begin this examination of the turn of the century Heder. If only for its pithiness and nastiness, I choose a passage on his Heder years from Chaim Weizmann's autobiography, Trial and Error. Few can marshal tart asides like the first president of the State of Israel. Quote, like all Jewish boys, I went to the Heder, beginning at the age of 4. Like nearly all Heders, mine was a squalid one-room school. If my Heder differed from the others, it was perhaps in the possession of a family goat, which took shelter with us in cold weather. And if my first Rebbe or teacher differed from the others, it was in the degree of his pedagogical incompetence. Warm evocations, end quote. Warm evocations of Heder life were rare. Few inclined to wax nostalgic about Eastern Europe recalled Heders with tenderness. Even Abraham Kahan's hapless, rich David Levinsky, as we discussed in our first lecture, remembers with fondness nearly everything about his lost. Is there an echo?
No, it's fine.
Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, fine. Even Levinsky, as we discussed in our first lecture, remembers with fondness nearly everything about his lost Lithuanian hometown. This is a symptom of his pathology, as Kahan understands it, but speaks of his Melamed as a sadist seeking pleasure from the torture of his boys. Quote, a classroom filled with death, end quote, said leading early 19th century Jewish Enlightenment thinker Isaac Ber Levinson of the traditional Jewish primary school in which the majority of East European Jewish boys between the ages of 3 and 4 and 12 were educated mostly in Bible and liturgy. Heder children are sheep, caught in the clutches of a prowling wolf. This is how Mendel Mocher puts it in his novel Fathers and Sons. Simon Dubnov, in his first published essay in the newspaper Ruski Evray in 1880, describes Heders in his hometown Mitislav thusly, quote, a crime is committed there, the massacre of young innocents. Critics were unrelenting. The school's curriculum dreadful, its teachers untrained, its physical conditions unsanitary. Chief among its critics were Maskilim, the self-consciously enlightened Jews for whom education was central to their campaign for the transformation of East European Jewish life. The Heder teacher was deemed by them an outstanding foe. And as a privately run institution, without the formal sponsorship enjoyed even by Talmud Torahs, the term used for communally run schools for children too poor to pay for a Heder education, Heders were especially vulnerable to attack. The religious journalist Eliezer Meir Lipschitz, in a generally sympathetic, rather unusually unsympathetic portrait of the Heder, admits that by the turn of the century, even in traditional circles, the word melamed had come to be synonymous more or less with bottling or wastrel. He complements his study of Heders with a sampling of the better-known melamed jokes, all of them popular, he insists, among religious Jews. If all else fails, so goes one well-known joke, you can kill yourself or become a melamed, and the former is preferable. This bleak portrait of Heder education was providing a scientific empirical scaffolding in now little known, but at the time widely discussed work by medical investigators. Published first in 1904, those studies by doctors of the hygienic shortcomings of Heders had appeared in the Russian language as early as 1879. We find the assertion that the Heder is literally deadly. The Russian Society for the Protection of National Health published in 1904 research, work cited as authoritative by several Jewish journalists, that examined the Heders in the Moldovanka neighborhood of Odessa, one of the poorer parts of town. Here, Jewish infant mortality rates of boys between the ages of 0 and 5 were compared with infants of the city as a whole and found to be half the average. I mean, this much we can be comfortable with. However, mortality rates among Heder boys of Odessa's Moldovanka of 5 to 10 years were double the average. The long hours, 8 to 9 hours daily, I'm not suggesting this is true science. It was thought to be true science. I'm unable to investigate whether it's true science. I'm trying to preempt the question. The long hours, 8 to 9 hours daily, the poverty of the pupils, the lack of activity in stuffy, badly ventilated rooms, precipitated, in the words of the report, quote, illness and death. Much the same pattern was found in the city of Kharkiv in 1908 in the new Jewish-sponsored scientific journal, Еврейский медицинский голос, written by a field worker for the Society for the Promotion of Enlightenment of Russia's Jews, known by its acronym OPER. This was a copiously documented study with data on the number of windows in local Heders as a key to ventilation, their furnishings, the measurement of pupil sizes, etc. The Heders described here were guilty of much more than a mere lack of air, light, or activity, the rather prosaic criticisms of one authority at a time. These were places that stamped out life with what was believed by some to be scientifically demonstrative regularity. A final example, before I problematize all of this, a final example of the ineptitude and worse of Heders. The single most detailed exposition on Heders, produced in pre-revolutionary Russia, is a 100-odd-page Russian language volume entitled The Contemporary Heder, written by Sovrenny Heder, written by field workers of the OPER, surveying with the use of questionnaires and visits dozens of Heders each in various parts of the Pale of Settlement in Poland. The report found, for instance, that of the 95 Malamans, or Heder teachers, surveyed in the Ekaterinoslav province, a mere 23 said that sometimes they read a book. 72 never did. And this was not because they were excessively engrossed in Holy Script. The majority of the Malamans surveyed in this province could not translate accurately a biblical text. Little Jewish history was taught in Heders here, and many students surveyed did not know of the existence of a second temple, let alone its destruction. Despite the surprising fact that only 29 of the approximately 100 children surveyed in Ekaterinoslav Heders spoke Yiddish at home, a very low number. compared with other regions of the Pale. All instruction in Heders in this province was in Yiddish, further testimony to the inflexibility of the Heder curriculum. Here, as elsewhere, Melamids were mostly old, few read newspapers. In Zhytomyr of the 90 asked, 8 said that sometimes they read one. Also in Zhytomyr, a more Jewishly stable and literate region than rather remote Yekaterinoslav, quote, and I'm quoting the Russian study, the Melamid who knows no Hebrew grammar, states the study, is a pathetic feature of our daily life, end quote. Not a rarity, such benighted souls were disturbingly representative. To the extent to which any institution in East European Jewry then was thought to define the limits of tradition and the prerequisites for cultural modernization, it was the Heder. Many self-consciously modern Jews had over the years called for its abolition. Others issued calls for thoroughgoing drastic reform. These broadsides were, or so I had long assumed, based on existing secondary literature on the schools, rehearsed along well-defined ideological lines, with the various factions in late 19th century Russian Jewish life, Zionists, Jewish socialists, Yiddishists, others, seeking to make Heders conform predictably to their ideologies. The story seemed a clear-cut one then. Old-style, outdated, badly ventilated schools, pitted against the institutions of a new, modernized, ambitious, post-liberal Jewry. Abolish them or radically change them along ideologically determined lines. Beyond the darkest, most inflexible corners of traditional Judaism, it was in these terms that debate over Heder was couched, or so I thought. It was with real surprise that I chanced upon 2 years ago, in a previously restricted collection in a Moscow archive, detailed data on Heder reform, including transcripts of teachers' meetings, where turn-of-the-century Heders were described by Russian Jewry's teachers and school administrators in very different terms. I'll pause in a few minutes and talk a little bit about this discovery. This raw material prompted me to reread press reports of the period, as well as archival sources in Jerusalem and elsewhere, which confirmed the impression I gleaned from the Russian archives. I found that the juxtapositions between old and new, anachronistic and progressive, did not prompt the discussions on Heder reform, at least not to the extent I previously was led to believe based on the secondary sources on the topic. As I looked closely at the rhetoric on the Heders, the lines dividing the camps of Russian Jewry tended to blur. The same lines that had appeared so stark in the historical literature, much of it written or at least inspired by political groups. On one level, then, this lecture, which is in effect a conversation about conversations, demonstrates a remarkable consensus in Russian Jewry, in an episode that has been told, like much else in Russian Jewish history, in rather flattened ideological terms, written by Zionists, Bundists, by political groups, a self-fulfilling historical enterprise of those who airbrush antagonists with the sincerity, cunning, or innocence of political conviction. The debate over Heder is among the, alas, numerous spheres of the Russian Jewish past where the historical canon, as it now exists, is a mere cipher of what transpired and quickly receded from view. On another level, this is, as surprising as it may sound, a study in the wages of nostalgia. In Eastern Europe, before the convulsions of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, shtetl, Hasidism, even the Heder, came to be transformed into sites of imagined authenticity among some urban, acculturated Jewish intellectuals. They emerged as constructs, born out of the conflicting ideologies that made the Jewish street because substantial numbers of the brightest youth in Russian Jewry were beginning to look for their futures beyond Jewry in radical politics and elsewhere. The educators whose voices we examine in this lecture all wanted the Heder change dramatically. Its curriculum revamped, exercise added to its regimen, the study of modern languages, Russian especially, introduced, and corporal punishment abolished. In fact, it is unclear in their proposals, as different as they were, what would be left of the old-style Heder once their proposals were implemented, which of course they were only sporadically before the Russian Revolution transformed the cultural political terrain irrevocably. Yet again, almost without exception, the educators we examine insisted that the new schools be called Heders and Talmud-Torahs, and more importantly, that their transformations, however drastic, not traduce the essential qualities of the institution, whatever these might be. As they saw it, and there was remarkable consensus on this score across the spectrum of organized Jewish life, it was crucial for Heders to continue to exist. And despite everything I said before, the reason for agreement on the score was not merely pragmatic, as I'll argue. It was more than a recognition that some 5/6 of Russia's Jewish boys were, as late as 1910, enrolled in the schools. Such numbers are misleading, since enrollment in Heders meant by the turn of the century usually no more than a stint of some 2 to 3 years. Rather, as the educators we studied tonight themselves asserted, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, the existence of Heders provided Jewish culture with something essential, despite their terrible shortcomings. These much disparaged schools were arsenals, even gems. It is this dilemma that is at the heart of our inquiry tonight. Hence, it is this, as I will argue in this talk, that was meant when time and again, in the Russian language transcripts I examined, it was asserted that the new transformed Heders would serve as national institutions. Nacionalnaya Evreistaya Shkola. Some such calls were made by self-avowed committed Jewish nationalists, but most were not, but by teachers and school directors well outside the Jewish nationalist camp, as we would understand it today. A reconsideration of what was meant in such discussions by nationalists, and part of our discussion will be to try to rediscover what was meant by this term, should open us up to a more nuanced and fuller appreciation of cultural strategies in late imperial Russian Jewish life. Strategies that cut across schematic boundaries, that were eclectic in their search for ways to sustain a threatened Russian Jewish culture. In promoting Heders, what many sought was to identify and somehow freeze in time a prop, a crucial bulwark of what they believed to be a now embattled culture. It is then the politics of unease that fueled this reinvention of the Heder. Heder, much like Shell, were sought out as emblems to sustain seemingly timeless notions of a once self-sufficient culture now under siege. In this context, the term national was utilized, as we'll see, as a code, not for a particular ideology like Zionism, but as a synonym for quintessentially Jewish, for something basic to one's ethnicity or culture. It was a term utilized by ideological nationalists as well as by those who were inclined to believe in the eventual integration of Jews in a multinational empire. Its use signals a quest for elusive institutions that might help render a now fragmented culture once again whole. I'll return to my text in a moment. How I came by this material. soon after arriving in Moscow to teach at the Russian State Humanities University, not knowing what I would actually find in the archives, because inventories to date of Jewish material in archives in the former USSR are dreadful. And in fact, in terms of Moscow archives, there were not any inventories at the time when I arrived 2 years ago. I befriended, as one does in this culture where friendship is everything, because there's not much else, a number of people who knew about holding somewhat informally, even though they didn't know much about the material that they knew existed, and which is often a case in terms of things Jewish in the former USSR. And I was given lists, simply raw lists of holdings in various local archives, including parts that were locked or officially locked. And among the list, there was a name of a Lichny personal file of someone named Pesach Marek. Now, Piotr Marek, or Pesach Marek, as he was known in the Yiddish world, was a historian of education of some notes, wrote a good book on Russian Jewish education, and in the book, based on some very interesting archival sources, he would leave these tantalizing notes at the bottom indicating that I've drawn this source from my personal archives and I have a lot more material. And so it was rumored, no more than that, among specialists of Russian Jewry that Marek had collected material. Marek also was not only a historian of Russian Jewish education, but was an agent of the OKF, based in Moscow, and inspecting the schools in the outlying areas closest to Moscow in the Pale, in Lita, Lithuania, and Belarus, a few hundred miles away. That's all I knew about him. I don't admire his book on education, but certainly didn't come to Moscow planning to do much with him. And when I saw this name, Pesach Marek, and signed it, 282 files, which suggested an enormous archive, I was intrigued. It turned out I found all of his personal papers. He had been an avid collector, a rather actually middle-level mediocre historian, which could make for an avid collector, who traveled throughout the Pale, collecting and writing down notes from provincial archives that no longer exist on tiny little sheets. There are probably about 100,000 of these tiny little sheets in the archive, along with other things, and simply collected everything. And then, serving in his capacity as the representative of the Enlightenment Society, would travel to schools and would keep diaries. Keep diaries on Shnepa, keep diaries of his impressions of teachers, of students. And I found all his diaries. I found all of his letters. Material that had been given over to his friend Yakov Mazet, chief rabbi of Moscow, before and just after the revolution, after Marek's death outside of Moscow in 1920. Marek had also written, just before his death, a full-length history of the Russian Jewish intelligentsia that I also found, and that's in his hand in the Russian language. I had never actually entered the Russian archive before. I was never given permission to enter a Russian archive before the ended up there because on the archival list, he was listed as Pissimaric Zionist, Pissimar Zionist. And so the papers of this misbegotten Zionist were put alongside the papers of some of the most sensitive state secrets in Russia. In any event, that's the human background to the material that I'll be talking about today. I brought along a portable photocopy machine and brought out several thousand sheets after cutting the deal. Back to the formal lecture. It was only in the 1890s that the Russian government permitted Heders to operate with little interference. Before then, Heders were subject to sporadic, rarely crippling interference by authorities, and this was true, in fact, of all private, unregistered schools in Russia, including the numerous informal peasant schools that previously had been subject to much the same intervention. By 1921-22, 1902, the OPER, the leading Jewish organization in Russia, devoted since its origins in the 1860s to promoting Jewish education, decided after a decade-long debate to add Heder support to its top goals. Resistance had been fierce, a reflection of a general dislike for the schools, distrust of their teachers, and a sense that the organization could best serve Russian Jewry through support of higher education. Still, the OPER now shifted its priorities, with Heder reform assuming a new visibility and importance. And indeed, Heder reform emerged as among the 2 or 3 most discussed items these years on the Jewish communal agenda. Even a casual perusal of the Russian Jewish press of the period readily shows this. Pick up almost at random issues of the Russian Jewish newspaper Voskhod, for instance, the turn of the century, true by spring 1903, the Kishinev pogrom had changed the focus of news reporting sharply, but before then, certainly if you picked up a newspaper, you would find numerous articles in every issue on school reform. In a single issue, for example, in spring 1902, the lead article in the Voskhod begins, quote, "Questions regarding the reform of Jewish school affairs and educating our children in the Jewish spirit agitate the contemporary Russian Jewish community," and turn the page, and then the next piece states, quote, "The question of national education," note the term national education, "preoccupies everyone's mind." Both articles speak at length about Heders and how they must be changed. In the historical literature on Russian Jews, this interest in Heders is described mostly, as I indicated earlier, in ideological terms, and mostly as a Zionist story, in terms of the Heder Mitukan, the so-called reformed Heder promoted as part of the agenda of the Zionist movement. Here the tale is all but exclusively told in terms of nationalists versus integrationists or traditionalists, Zionists versus opponents. In this version, the new Heder is essentially a Zionist intervention, part of a system of some 900 schools by 1903 that taught in the Russian Empire at least a modicum of Ivrit, the so-called natural system of language instruction advocated by the Heder Mitukan that insisted that the curriculum, or at least a major part of the curriculum, had to actually be conducted in Hebrew and taught in the Hebrew language. Now, the creation of some 900 Heders was no doubt an impressive achievement, amounting to no fewer than 10% of the admittedly grossly deflated total number of officially registered Heders in the empire. Now, in their own accounts of the a natural, end quote. In short, a natural process of old age and disintegration. Youth taking over where the old have left off. A straightforward cultural nationalist narrative with the young Zionist teacher inheriting the mantle for the next generation. Even traditionalist critics of the institution, who by all accounts waged a bitter battle against this reformed Heder, are written away in this narrative, dismissed in this benevolent, positivistic version of old age, death, and renewal, with the Zionists as the natural and inevitable beneficiaries of the best of the past. Now, Zuta, later a prominent educator in Jewish Palestine and the author of several textbooks widely used in the yeshuv, provides an influential description in his memoirs, published in the mid-30s, of the origins of Heder reform in Russia as a product of Zionism and its impact. He describes the first meeting of Jewish primary school teachers sponsored by OPEA, held in Orsha near Vitebsk in Lithuania in spring 1902. Brought together for the first time were, in Zuta's words, L'umim hemipolanim, nationalists and assimilationists, in a meeting that Zuta's Zionist mentor in Yekaterinslav, the Stalin Zionist leader Menachem Musishkin, claimed patronizingly would be no more than a gathering of teachers of mathematics and Russian. He urged Zuta to attend and only to storm the walls of the assimilationists. The majority of the participants were interested in schools merely as a vehicle for the integration of Jews into Russian society, or so Zuta tells us. Such integrationist calls were central to the agenda of the OPEA since its inception, especially during the heady liberal days of Tsar Alexander II in the 1860s, and even in relatively bleak late imperial Russian Jewry, integrationists remained at the helm of the OPEA. Yet the nationalists, as Zuta explains in his book, were exceptionally persuasive in Orsha and turned the meeting around. A nationalist plan won a large majority. Zuta and another Zionist were invited to write the official curriculum for Jewish primary schools, published the next year in Russia. In short, a happy, unexpected victory for the Zionist side, who managed, despite terrible odds, to win over a room full of highly skeptical, fiercely integrationist intellectuals. Quite an achievement. That is, if this is what occurred. There is considerable reason to doubt it, though. Ironically, it is Zuta himself who is responsible for raising doubts about the veracity of his account. Since he deposited at the National Library in Jerusalem the only existing copy, this is how he describes it in his memoirs, of the 43-page Russian language transcript of the Orsha meeting with detailed summary of his proceedings. The title of the transcript is in Zuta's hand, with a note of dedication to the library. The transcript, produced by an OPEA recording secretary, with no vested interest in distorting the proceedings, contradicts Zuta's account, written some 30 years later, in every single respect. Comparing Zuta's recollection to the Russian transcript of the meeting provides us with a glimpse of how constrained is our sense of this debate, and as I suspect, much else in the cultural life of Russian Jewry. It's striking, quite extraordinary, really. As you'll see, that Zuta's sense of what transpired at the meeting was so clear and distinct that this document, which was in his possession at the time when he wrote the book, had little, if any, impact on it. He didn't even bother to dispute its contents. I suspect he never noticed the difference between the accounts. Take, for instance, the opening session held at the Orsha Talmud Torah, a grinding, law, characteristically Jewish Russian session that broke at 2:30 a.m. that night. 76 people, often more than once, are recognized by the chair. Himself, by the way, a well-known local Zionist. Now, it's impossible, clearly, to do justice to the full discussion here. But here is a brief summary of the session, nationally oriented schools. This, he says, would be unfortunate. Here, as elsewhere, in the transcript, though, it was nationalists who set the agenda, in a discussion dominated from the beginning by them. Even Ms. Ziller makes the point that an emphasis on Hebrew as a pedagogical tool, as promoted by the Zionist Heder is misplaced, since not language, but rather history, the history of pogroms and oppression, is how she puts it. It is through the teaching of history that national values are implicated. She too sees that the goals and perhaps not the means of nationalist educators are legitimate. Nearly everyone at this session agrees that the Heder, or some substitute like the communally funded Talmud Torah, is essential for reasons that are, as is repeatedly stressed, national inherent. Now, there is disagreement, but it is over how best to achieve a national education. Some insist on practical skills to make Jews more productive. Most argue, however, that schools must imbue students with spirit. They must educate, as several put it, as well as teach. By spirit, what is meant, and this is made clear repeatedly, is national content. The precise content of a national curriculum is left vague. Some express skepticism on this score, on how children can be educated in Hebrew, a language few understood. Another, the only participant in Orsha to make this point, argued for Yiddish, not Hebrew, in the classroom. National educational precedents in Switzerland, Scotland, Ireland, England are discussed at length here as models where, as several participants argue, national culture, often without the imposition of much religious teaching, are at the core of the primary school curriculum. Still, there was a consensus at the meeting and beginning at its first session on the need for national education. Another example in a similar vein. This drawn from the OPE's Commission on Schools and Education under the chairmanship of the Zionist Chaim Bialko. The commission invited responses to a report on, quote, our communal national schools, Talmud Torahs, at a meeting held late 1904. Among the questions asked by the report were how to wean such communal schools from their mostly traditionalist administrations. How can teachers be improved? The transformation of such institutions must be the concern, the report insisted, quote, of the entire nation, end quote. At the meeting, hardly anyone questioned the report's recommendations that stressed the national needs of the Jews. The only debate was on how to best instill these values. Only families sympathetic to Jewish nationalism can do this on their own. Schools cannot, one speaker said. Some stressed the importance of Hebrew, others Yiddish. Only one speaker proposed doing away entirely with a separate national school. No one agreed, and he said nothing further. In another lengthy exposition, someone else elaborated on how, in inculcating national values, schools must distinguish between the requirements of nationalism, ethnicity, nationality, narodnost, utility, and religion. All must be served in one way or another. There was debate here over the priorities of one Jewish language or another. Yiddish found more partisans here than in Orsha. There was disagreement on how Talmud Torahs might best be infiltrated and run. With only one exception, no one raised objection to the need for a national Jewish school. On this score, here too, there was unambiguous consensus. A final bit of evidence before I try to make some sense of these findings. The words of Gershom Lifshitz at a meeting, again, of the Odessa branch of the OPEA. I reproduced this portion of his remarks from a transcript of the meeting, complete with a recorded catcall. Quote, I do not think that here we must talk about nationalist and religious education. Dr. Landensman called out, all we do is talk about nationalism. Lifshitz continues, I want to speak here only about the financial Russian Jewish circles interested in educational reform. Now, what did progressive Russian Jews, of the sort Zionists called assimilationists, mean when they insisted that Heder was essential? Why were ostensible non- or anti-nationalist Jews describing these schools in favorable terms as crucial for national life? And what did they mean when they used terms like national or nationalism? First, what we've encountered, assertions of nationalist commitment on the part of those who in most standard accounts of the period are described as non- or anti-nationalists, as opposed to Zionism or Bundism opposed to a Jewish political separatism, political or cultural separatism, must be seen, in, at least in part, in light of the linguistic politics of late imperial Russia, namely in the context of late imperial distinctions between, along the lines of a speaker quoted by me earlier, nationalism, nationality, religion, etc. The term narodnost is translated by most historians of the period as meaning nationality or ethnicity. This represented a category in Russian censuses, even prior to the first all-Russian census in 1897. And it was determined by asking respondents to report their native language. Nationality then was an accepted social category in a multinational empire where non-Russians made up by the late 19th century some 56% of the population. Hence, the words national or nationalist meant something different in late 19th century Russia than what came to be associated with the terms later in Jewish circles. Even Jewish integrationists then, those reasonably optimistic about the absorption of Jews in a multinational Russia, could remain, as they understood themselves, well within the larger consensus, whatever this meant in fragmented Russia, and still value and promote publicly their nationality. Second, a coherent non-Zionist nationalism was adopted, of course, in 1901 by the Jewish Socialist Bund, East European Jewry's leading socialist organization, with a surprisingly large membership of the tens of thousands, despite the risk entailed by joining this illegal movement. The Bund's preoccupation with the masses had had an influence in orienting a previously elitist Opeya agenda with its preference for the support of secondary and university students. Bundists, as well as others, had pressed the organization to pay greater attention to Cheder's and Talmud Torah's national Jewish schools, as the Bund understood them, if only because the majority of the Jewish nation used them. This in line with a more general tendency in Russian society at the time to reorient education to the needs of the masses. Third, the protocols we reviewed all dated from the end of what was, as we've described, a fierce, protracted debate in Opeya over the role of nationalism, of Hebrew, of Greek construction, etc., in schools receiving Opeya funds. By 1902, the Opeya decided to provide substantial funding for Heders, and what we might understand this the acceptance by even opponents of nationalism of nationalist terms as an attempt to make a good of a bad situation, as the quiet after the storm. Still, integrationist Jewish leaders of standing and distinction, Elion, Maria Sackler, and others whose favorable statements about nationalism I found, much to my surprise in these transcripts, were unlikely to have been intimidated into saying things with which they did not agree. And all spoke in nationalist terms, albeit in varying degrees of commitment. Moreover, debate after 1902 was not quashed in this organization, neither over nationalism nor other issues. At work here, then, is something more than any of these explanations provide, more than a byproduct of the reconfiguration of the meaning of nationalism, the impact of Zionism, the early tentative influence of the Bund, or organizational inertia in the Opeya. Crucial in this regard was the belief, as I suggested before, widespread in educational circles, that the youth were slipping away from things Jewish. This had to be stopped with whatever means were at Jewry's disposal, even if this meant made her way somehow into a circle, an intellectual circle, a formal circle, that met in Odessa for some 10 years, made up of Hara'am, Simon Dubnov, Mendel Mokrospory, Menachem Margulis, who I mentioned actually in a faculty colloquium just yesterday, but who was a formidable figure, and Maria Sacker, and she was the only one who was written out of Jewish history. She simply disappeared. You won't find encyclopedia entree on Maria Sacker. There were, I found one or two descriptions of her as vituperative, but this was not a calm crowd. And apparently her politics were at least vaguely integrationist, but then so were Menachem Margulis. All the rest appear in canonized Jewish history. In fact, those four are largely responsible in many ways for the canonization of Russian Jewish history, and she disappears, simply disappears, and appears at a moment one has a sense that she was an important presence, and is written off, and can only now probably be recaptured with the use of archives. Maria Sacker captured this sense of crisis succinctly, if also with a measure of skepticism, when she acknowledged at an OPEA meeting that it was a widely held assumption, one that bolstered the positions taken by the most extreme nationalists, whom she poured, that Jewish youth, having shunned nationalism, are in large numbers abandoning their people. This accusation is, she said, no truer than the charge widespread at the time that youth were slaves to sexual depravity. The one was unlikely as the other. Now, whether sexual libertines or not, that a cultural slippage was occurring was widely believed, and probably for a good reason. The two most widely cited proofs for such a slippage were Jewish enrollment in Russian schools and the reading habits of the Jewish young, as quantified in a good number of studies of the period, in studies of books borrowed at Jewish lending libraries in the Russian Pale settlements in Poland. Discussions of both were harnessed explicitly and with frequency by Jewish educators to calls for Heder and Talmud Torah reform. First, the threat posed by Russian schools. Perhaps surprisingly, in light of the quotas on Jews imposed by the Russian government in the late 1880s, enrollment by Jews in Russian schools was not decisively checked, much to the chagrin of Russian reactionaries. Quotas did not, on the whole, apply to girls' schools. In many towns in the Pale of settlements, 1/2 of the turn-of-the-century female secondary school population was Jewish. Also, externs or external students studying for examination outside of the formal school curriculum, as of 1891, could take qualifying exams for university entrance, which prompted the use of thousands of private tutors by Jews aspiring to enter university. Privately run schools proliferated. A large percentage of Russia's private schools opened since the 1890s were Jewish run. And in any event, neither state primary schools nor commercial schools fell under quota regulations, nor did all educational districts impose quotas with equal severity. Odessa, for example, was especially strict. Nearby Kharkov, much less. All told, by 1912, 128,000 Jews were registered in Russian schools of various sorts. Fully 1/4 of this number were girls in secondary schools and progymnasiums. And of the approximately 350,000 enrolled at this time in Heders, increasingly this meant a mere 2 or 3 year stint, followed by registration in a Russian school or time spent with tutors. No less disturbing for Jews interested in sustaining a coherent and literate Jewish culture were statistics on the reading habits of the Jewish young, the last example I'll cite. There were numerous articles on Russian Jewish reading habits published in this period, several empirically based, and these studies in turn were cited by supporters of Heder reform, who argued that the cultural predilections of the young could be checked only by firming up national schools where Jewish identity was uncontested. Take, for instance, an article in the journal Hashiloach on library lending statistics in 1904-05 in Poltava, in the Ukraine, a typical southern Jewish town, as its author asserted with some justification. author examines the various sorts of publications checked out: newspapers, school textbooks, novels, poetry, general nonfiction, etc. Of the most germane statistics, in 1904-05, a total of 35,265 items were borrowed in the library, with its 1,362 subscribers. No fewer than 80% were in Russian, 13% in Hebrew, 7% in Yiddish. Most of the Yiddish language items were newspapers. Hebrew readers Hebrew readers were mostly students borrowing books for school purposes, for reading assignments, not pleasure. The bulk of the adults reading Hebrew books in its library, 70% of the adults reading Hebrew, were laborers and artisans, the town's poorer and presumably least acculturated Jews. The middle-class Jewish reader made up a mere 13% of the Hebrew readers, but a large percent of the readers of Russian. The young represented the single largest group of library users, with 44% below the age of 18, and a substantial percentage of the remainder between the ages of 18 and 25. 75% of all the children's books checked out were in Russian. Otherwise, with the exception of textbooks, youth here read little Hebrew. 86% of the novels read by library borrowers were in Russian. Quote, "The first word that reached my consciousness was Russian. Songs, tales, nannies, children's games with friends, all of these were in Russian," end quote. So writes in his memoirs Oscar Grusenberg, a Jew, later a distinguished lawyer and a defender of Jews. He was part of the defense team for Mendel Bayless, a man who remained throughout his life committed to protecting his brethren, but whose primary emotional commitments were Russian. Grusenberg's case is extreme. He grew up in the 1870s in a highly acculturated Jewish household in the remote South Russian city of Yekaterinslav, hardly a typical Jewish town like Poltava. Still, with the specter of those like young Grusenberg haunting early 20th century Russian Jewry, there was a sustained, intense, now mostly forgotten discussion, where with an almost uncanny unanimity across cultural and political lines of organized Jewry, it was agreed that something drastic had to be done to save youth from themselves. This was not a debate over the horrors of anti-Semitism, of the sort that we typically associate with late imperial Russia, though no doubt anti-Semitism motivated Jewish self-assertion as well as the move of some Jewish young to shed their Jewishness. Rather, it was a discussion on how to keep the young receptive to the vibrancy of things Jewish in the face of potent attractions from Russian culture. The threat seemed at the time so real that despite the fierce differences that turned Russian Jewish life into a cultural and political battlefield over matters of language, politics, religion, class, etc., there was surprising agreement on the nature of the problem and to an extent also the cure. The cure, according to some, was a drastic one: the reinvention of one of the most denigrated and patronized of all East European Jewish institutions, the Heder. This anachronistic emblem, this pedagogical dinosaur, was now seen widely as essential for Jewry's future. The irony of the situation was not lost on its often bemused defenders. These were, in truth, not really defenders of the Heder. It is not that they had faith in it, only a lack of confidence in what Jewish modernity would look like. Would look like. Trying to reach my dramatic conclusion. These were, in truth, not really defenders of the Heder. It is not that they had faith if they had faith in it, only a lack of confidence in what Jewish modernity would look without it. Theirs was a nostalgia born out of unease with the present, a sensibility, and with this I will conclude, similar to the way in which Simon Dubnov, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, about life in his native townland, the shtetl Mstislav, where he returns in the mid-1880s to recuperate from a long illness. Along with much of the rest of the subconsciously Jewish intelligentsia of the time, he had escaped the small town. Now he returns for a prolonged stay. He is already a writer of some reputation in the small but vibrant world of Russian Jewish journalism. And he now sees Mstislav through different eyes. The once vast chasm separating his modernist aspirations from the rabbinic world of his saintly grandfather, a leading local figure, appears to lessen. And I quote, "From the autumn of 1884, writes Dubnov, the following picture could be seen in the quiet provincial town. On two parallel streets, grandfather and grandson sat in their book-lined studies. One cultivated wisdom of the Talmud and the rabbis and transmitted it to his listeners. The other plunged with equal zeal into the new wisdom of the age and had his own, but more numerous, audience. Both lived like Nazarenes, obedient to strict vows, each with his own understanding of life, intellectually different, ethically identical." End quote. Or so he hopes. Crucial is Dubnov's sense, as expressed here, that his own audience is immeasurably more numerous, if less visible in this remote shtetl, than his grandfather's, a man who represents a small town world fast disappearing. Dubnov can afford to dwell on the virtues of shtetl life. In fact, he is drawn back with renewed commitment, or at least attachment, a perspective born out of his sense that it is increasingly a thing of the past. His attitude to Mstislav is now warm, tolerant, and strangely nostalgic, the product of loss and cultural triumph, unease with one's triumph, and a sense of alienation from a modern culture that he and others have sought hard to create, and that nonetheless falls between your fingers. The thick, resilient Yiddishkeit, solidified, or so it now seems, in the Heders and the Shtetlach of Eastern Europe, is increasingly a thing of the past, which is what he had